And let us welcome the writer-director, Matthew Weiner. Hello, sir.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So, how are you, Danny?
I'm
Thank
good.
you for doing this.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So you have spent the last 10 years doing one of the most acclaimed, iconic television shows of all time. And coming off of that, you then make your feature directorial debut, because you directed multiple episodes of Mad Men, with this movie. Why this story coming off of Mad Men?
it doesn't really lay out like that. I'm sure
Then how does it?
It lays out, well, basically, I wrote the pilot of Mad Men. And about 2.5, 3 quick years later, I got a job on The Sopranos. And after my first season on The Sopranos, I wrote this movie. And so it was another 4 years before I wrote the second episode of Mad Men. And it's now been 14 years since I wrote the pilot of Mad Men. And, 9 years for this. So obviously, it takes a while to get stuff made. Some of it was because I was busy. But, I mean, this was a story that came to me. And I don't really think in terms of genre. I don't really think in terms of formula. My intention was kind of to do a movie in the tradition of the early 70s movies that I love, that are often socially conscious and have a lot to do with the truth and sort of present life as it is and are not formulaic. I don't know if you know the movie 5 Easy Pieces is a big favorite of mine. And I kind of turned, the issues of what was going on for me, which is not just our experience of being alienated. And I'd reached a point in my life where I was happily married, I have kids. My wife is certainly my best friend, but my male friends had really disappeared. And I was saying, like, you see friendship, so it's such a wish fulfillment in most entertainment, the bromance and as Steve says it in the movie, nobody eats alone, And I was like, so what does hold friendships together? What is holding things together? And then I added into it basically 2 characters who I think in some post-cinematic way think that they're living in a stoner comedy, except for that their life is actually not progressing at all. And you don't know if the friendship is holding their life where it is or if it's the best thing in it. But as bleak as that concept of growing up is, what I really wanted to say was, like, to have a friendship like that is that's the first line I had in the movie, is what's in the trailer. That's the first thing I had written down, was that friendship is a lot rarer than love because there's nothing in it for anyone. And I just kind of wanted to say, like, well, what if you strip everything away? Don't act like that's nothing. That's everything.
What's so interesting, you were talking about the films of the 70s, because it does have such a Hal Ashby vibe. This movie does.
He's one of my favorites.
And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I love it so much.
I'm glad. That's kind of like
it feels like a Hal Ashby film, and in some ways a James L. Brooks film too.
I'll take either of these. These are great.
It's not bad.
I admire both of those.
What was the spark that started this particular story? Was there something very specific that made this idea pop for you? And then how did that flourish?
It was it's like a lot of ideas. It was a bunch of things sort of going together. I mean, one of them was my wife's family, has a family business, and there was an issue about her mother's getting up in years, her father's been gone for a long time, and I saw the family sort of like what was going to happen to that business, and the successful, more transparently successful children were not really entitled to any of it, but you are. And the idea of, like, well, what part of it's the family? What part are you entitled to because you're the family? And can your inheritance be an expression of love? It shouldn't be, but it's really all it is. And then I actually had a total confluence of things that happened. One of them was realizing that I would watch the weather every morning, and I had my oldest son was at that point 6 years old, and he would go out in the balcony every morning, and he would come in, and he was 100% accurate. And I was like, well, what happened to me that I have absolutely no relationship with nature? Did I ever have that skill? And now I'm like in a bottle, and you come and live in New York, and you see Central Park and the first sunny day of spring and how people get naked. And you're like, what is our relationship to that? Why are we so far from it? And it goes along with food, too. I just kept thinking of the distance that we have from whatever our supposed natural state is. And along with that, the fact that I fell in love with this character who's unable to feel, which is Owen's character, who is basically drinking and using drugs and using women to avoid any of the deep sensations, which I find is a big part of a lot of people that I know. And suddenly this dynamic came across along with this friendship issue where I was like, well, there is one redeeming thing, is that he has this guy that he knows, and maybe they're sustaining each other's lack of growth through this friendship, but it's also the only redeeming quality for both of them. And I love this idea of telling the story in a Hal Ashby style that was not formulaic. Could I create a plot where you had no idea what was going to happen next, and you wouldn't be adrift, you just wouldn't know? And there's a love triangle in it. There's all these sort of elements, but there's a lot of surprises in it, I think, which is, it's different than Mad Men, but I think in its idea that it's about four incredibly flawed people, and it may be the audience's experience as well as the character's experience of realizing that they're flawed over the life of the movie, and how they're flawed and how that's expressed, and that everybody's just doing the best that they can, and you should really, in the most Pollyanna way, it's so simple, it's right in front of us, but to appreciate tiny things like food and love and friendship, and just don't run away from that, because everything in our world right now is encouraging us to sort of some idealized version of it that is, like all idealized things, unattainable, and it makes what you have seem very disappointing, and a lot of people just want to escape. It's all about our urge to escape.
Well, along those lines, as far as the urge to escape, it seems, in this movie, these guys, they smoke a lot of weed.
Yes, they do.
They smoke a lot of weed.
For two different purposes.
For two different purposes. And in Mad Men, there was quite a bit of drinking and
I don't
smoking
know
cigarettes.
if I'd say
that was
that.
sort of
Yes.
So it seems that functional addiction is this sort of motif.
Yes.
And what about functional addiction is so interesting to you, because you seem to explore it to such great depths in both of these pieces?
It's called You Are Here because it's about the idea of just being in the moment. And it's spoken of in Zen terms a lot of times, but the idea that you could actually be in the midst of an experience. And I think that for many of us, and I'm not just myself, this is unattainable because it requires effort. And anyone who's ever gone somewhere where your phone doesn't work or lost your phone and felt the deep, deep anxiety of missing that. And I'm one of those people. And the phone's amazing. It's an amazing device. And it's actually brings us closer to each other. You can communicate more than ever. But the idea that you get into these cycles, and I think that when I was researching cigarettes for the Mad Men pilot, and the pilot is about the moment where they say that you cannot make any more medical claims. And Philip Morris had this huge crisis because everything they did was based on being doctors' advice, and which was the most healthy and which is, whatever. And they went with this campaign called Marlboro Country, which I think they still use, which was just some sort of vague state of being that you get from nicotine. It was a drug illusion. And the idea that you don't have to be in reality, you can come to Marlboro Country, it's a drug. And even though Ben Zach's character says that, people made beer before they had an alphabet, changing your state is part of the human condition, much like sleeping. It's just in every culture, there's some kind of, you find it, as soon as there's a green plant, they're making alcohol. There is a tendency, I think, for people who, for a certain kind of person, and I guess owing to the interest people have in my work, certainly the Mad Men is populated with them, who avoid their feelings by constantly changing their state, by keeping those addictions going. It becomes both a real thing and a symbolic thing, Hopefully the audience can recognize it, as anyone who's binge-watched something and missed a day of work. And also it becomes something for the characters to say, I guess I'm not saying to the audience, go out and play, it's a nice day. But I am saying that we get alienated and dissociated from each other, and there are if you can bring yourself to sort of drop these habits, even for a moment, you can experience something amazing.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your creative process.
Sure.
And because as you were discussing the structure of this film, it is completely unpredictable in a way that I haven't seen in quite a long time. How do you come up with this? Do you structure it all the way through? Do you allow yourself to find these crazy turns, which don't feel like crazy turns, and yet simultaneously the plot goes in completely different directions, and in a way where it doesn't even jolt you? It feels organic to the story, but yet it's completely surprising. What was your process to get there?
What? It's kind of like most of the things I write. I have an idea of who the people are, and I have an idea of the ending. And then I sort of try and hang it, even though I said it has no formula, I try and hang it on a kind of a traditional movie structure, if there is such a thing, which I guess the way that, it evolved supposedly from silent movies. But like Billy Wilder movies have a little bit of a traditional, Hal Ashby movies have them, and then they kind of breaks down. But it's basically just what you think, a beginning, a middle, and an end. What's the climax? Where's their twist in the second act? I literally start thinking about things that way. And then you start working on the outline, and scenes come to mind. You're like, well, where does that go? Where does that go? How does that work? That's a funny idea. How does that work? And what happens is you just keep ironing it out and ironing it out. And the funny thing is at a certain point, I realized that this story of friendship, that this is a romance between these two characters, and it was kind of like structured like a romance in the sense that most romances are boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. And the climax is the guy losing the girl or the girl losing the guy. And I was missing, once I had the conflict in there in the second act, and I had romance in the second act, and there were all these things, but the most, like everything, the big scene at the end where they hash it out, I had completely skipped it because I didn't want to emotionally deal with it. So at a certain point, you're working with like everybody, you should have some. It's not wrong to have a mathematical process at some point, as long as you're flexible, and then the emotions take over. And I told you, there's certain twists in the story that were problems to solve, and you, like all of your problems to solve, from writing it, you walk away from it and hope that something comes to you, or someone suggests something, any of that. A lot of eavesdropping. I'm always eavesdropping. Yeah. Or, in the end, sometimes I think when I talked about like referencing other movies, that we reference other movies in life. I've always said, like, when people talk about Betty Draper on Mad Men, someone says, oh, it's like a Douglas Sirk movie. And I'm like, no, it's really not. Betty Draper watches Douglas Sirk movies. These guys are watching these movies and they're having these feelings, and at a certain point, most of the surprise in the story just comes from not having it be like what a movie would do. And not deliberately. It's not binary. It's like, well, a movie does this. The movie has a happy ending. I'm going to have a sad ending. It's not like that at all. I want the story to find its way, but a lot of times you just say, you know what? You show up to go see your friend and you want to apologize and they're not there. That's much more real than, that all of a sudden you get tension from that than from the movie version of like the perfect parking spot and,
Yeah.
So.
Should we watch one of our two clips?
Absolutely.
Let's run clip number 1. So Owen Wilson is terrific in this movie. It's a fantastic performance. How did you come to Owen?
I wrote it for Owen, and 8 short years later, he got the script. It really was. That's really the truth. I mean, I love the idea. I think all of these actors. Laura Ramsey, you don't know that well, but she's amazing in the movie.
She's wonderful in this movie.
But Amy and Zach and Owen are all doing things in this movie that they don't usually do. And what I wanted to do, particularly with Owen, was play with his screen persona, which is, guileless, selfish stoner that he is, and sort of say, like, well, what would happen? What's underneath that? Why is that person like that? And I couldn't get him the script for years, and then he was a fan of the show, and we had dinner, and I said, I wrote a movie for you, and he said yes, and then it was just a matter of like all of us finding when we were free.
So were you planning for years? Did you tell yourself, I'm going to make this movie one day? This is going to get done.
Yes.
Was it something that you've been
Yes.
wanting to get done over the years?
Yes. I always wanted this to be my first movie. It's very meaningful to me, and I kept thinking like it's so related to what's going on right now. I think people will recognize it. They will recognize the places. They will recognize what's ugly and what's beautiful. And I just felt like the more the time passed, it would end up just like not being worth telling that story anymore. It would just be too late. But I found, and I haven't heard any different stories from anybody, that every movie takes this long to get made. Occasionally, there's a flame under something, and it just happens. But for the most part, luckily, I've had a million people fall in and out of the cast. I always wanted Owen, and I couldn't even, it's a certain point you're like, something great happens, like Mad Men, and you're like, okay, what do you want to do? I want to do this movie. When can you do it? I don't know. So you have many reasons for what happens. But for me, this is just such a personal story, and I think it's strange in a way because it does have a lot of comedy in it, and these guys are really funny, but it does have like a sort of a spiritual element to it, which was unconscious for me. I mean, it kind of was pointed out to me by the actors while we were making it. I don't think there's a lot of movies where you will hear the word God and not used as a joke. The strange thing is that at the same time, it's very like the 70s movie. It has nudity in it and a lot of drug use, and it's kind of profane.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That was sort of the mixture.
I remember all that.
Well, it's a weird thing. It's not, we're so prude now.
Sure.
We only go one way or the other. You either got to go for full on, like the prurient version of it, or it doesn't exist in the same realm.
Well, it's so interesting that you just brought up the God element of the film, because that's literally what I was just about to ask you.
Oh, really?
Is that there's a whole storyline here that the film takes place in Amish country, a big portion of the film. And so there are Amish characters, and sometimes it's comedic, but sometimes it's very spiritual and profound. And one of my favorite scenes is a scene about God. So you're saying that it was unconscious.
Well, the weird thing is that, the story is that Owen's character has to stop taking drugs and Zach's character has to start taking drugs. They're in this together, but really, as this movie goes on, you realize that Owen has a drug problem and that Zach's character is mentally ill. And he is fixated on the Amish because he is very interested in nature, and he has a sort of philosophical, Luddite philosophy of like the earth and what's natural. And he finds the Amish to be an ideal in a way. And then when you bump up against the Amish, you sort of see that they are religious fanatics. And at the same time, there is something pure about what they're doing. So you may not want to live like them, but there is something pure about what they're doing. And so I used it as a way, I found out that they see real doctors. They see, you can't even say Western. They see English doctors is what they call non-Amish, and especially for mental illness. And so for me, it was a way to solve the problem of like, how do you get this person to, I'm trying not to give away the movie here, that's why I'm being so vague. But anyway, for me, if you say that they're really Amish people and you take them really seriously and that you realize that they grew up around here and he's kind of fixated on them, and then you start talking about, well, why do they live that way? And why can't we live that way? And you hear the virtues in it, and at the same time, you're like, I don't want to live that way. So the same way I'm not a vegetarian, but I'm very interested in where food comes from. I had one of my kids, we were at some party, and there was a chicken leg there, and I took a bite of it, and it was like, the skin was like raw or whatever, and I threw it in the garbage pail, and he looked up at me and he goes, Dad, that was a chicken's whole leg. And I was like, God, I'm an asshole. But we're so dishonest about it.
Was that the inspiration for the chicken scene?
It was a little bit of it. There's a little bit of it.
There's a chicken scene. It gets a little bloody.
The idea being that we're completely removed from the food supply, and this guy is, living in a condo, completely, with this treating his job irresponsibly. He is virtuous about his friend, but everything else is a joke to him. And he decides to clean up his act for this woman. And the first thing she does is she makes him go out and kill a chicken for dinner. And I kept thinking, like, this is probably the first honest thing this guy's ever done in his life. And I don't know if I could do it. to be responsible for what you're eating. It probably would make us a lot nicer to each other if we actually had to emotionally invest in that. Although every culture finds somebody to pay to do that because it's really hard. I've never done it.
Me
We
neither.
did not kill any chickens in the movie either, but they did kill about 50,000 of them while we were having this conversation.
Yeah. So you've just come off this tremendous run. You just finished shooting the final episodes of Mad Men, right?
Yes, we
And then-
finished it in July, and it will air next year, the last 7. I'm doing post on them.
Uh-huh. And then you've just finished your directorial debut.
Yes.
So what next? What are you thinking?
I don't know. I've written a play, but I think, which I may pursue that, but I think what I'm really going to do is and I think I bought a little time because the show's not going to be actually airing for a little bit, but I need to let the field go fallow for a little bit. 92 hours of the show, really expressing a lot of what I had to express, my own and other people's ideas, of course. And getting to make this movie finally, I kind of feel like it's time for me to shut up for a second and go back to eavesdropping for a living, which is what we do. Yeah, and go back to real life. And you know this, I mean, there's so much of the writer's experience has to do with actually living. And I'm lucky enough that I can go back to just, as I said, eavesdropping.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the next clip.
Okay, great.
Should we take questions from the audience? Is that
Yeah.
questions from the audience? Yes, go ahead. You.
Hi. First of all, I'm a big fan of Mad Men, so thank you for that. I recognize Danny from a few episodes as well.
Yes.
And more recently, an episode of Girls, which was really funny.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know you said that you wrote while writing the script, you wrote the role for Owen. I was wondering, did you have Amy or Zach in mind? Because you said it's not much of a comedy. I mean, it's obviously funny, but you ended up with 3 comedians.
Oh, it's definitely a comedy. I mean, it's they just do something. They change throughout the story. There's a lot of drama in it also. And no, I did not know Amy Poehler existed. Actually, I think when I wrote it, maybe she had just gotten on SNL, and Zach, just to remember the calendar. This is like before The Hangover. It wasn't like no one knew who he was, but I didn't know who he was. And so for me, it was one of these things. I met Zach right before The Hangover, actually, because John Hamm was friends with him, and he's just like exudes, pathos, and obviously he's really, besides being funny, he's a very he's a deep actor, and Amy came along last, and the idea of them playing brother and sister was exciting to both of them, and they kind of are a good match set, and it's one of these things where to explain the tone in the movie, it's maybe something you haven't seen before. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but I think Mad Men is similar in that sense. It doesn't really have a genre. It doesn't, it's kind of like the way I work. I work with story, and that's the most important thing to me. So what you will see is, Amy could have played it much broader than she did, and it probably would have been a little bit funnier. But we tried to keep it within the realm of reality. So the stuff is funny, but it's in the, smaller, it's in a more realistic vein.
Well, Mad Men felt like a really profound drama that at times was very funny. And this feels like a really funny movie that ends up becoming a profound drama by the time it's over.
That's all positive.
It's sort of my takeaway.
It's very different than Mad Men, I have to say that.
Yeah, completely.
And that's, I go by what the story is. The things that are similar, like I said, is there are 4 flawed characters there, and the attention to detail, I think I made it with the entire crew from the show. Production designer, cinematographer, producer, editor, casting, hair, makeup, props, all of it. And we kind of turned our attention on right now. And I think you'll see that level of detail, but a lot of it's about what's ugly and not about what's beautiful. Yes.
Thanks a lot for doing this.
Sure.
I want to get your thoughts as somebody who created such a great TV show about how people are consuming your television show. Do you have a preference, for example, on Netflix and the Apple Store, people are literally consuming seasons as 10-hour movies? Or do you have a preference of having it viewed episodic where, you see it live or
You know what? All of it's going to make me sound old in some weird way. The show came along exactly at the moment when the internet companies went from saying no one will watch anything online that's longer than 3 minutes, no one admitting that it was a technological issue, to people streaming whole shows, to my kids not even knowing that Netflix or iTunes are on the computer because there's a button and we have Apple TV. If they don't even know, they just think it's another kind of, it's like another station. I am an incredibly controlling person, and the most important thing for me is that I actually make the show in a way that hopefully you will have to pay full attention to it and not talk over it and not fill out your checkbook. And yes, it's weird to like see 5 or 6 years of your life consumed in like 7 days by some people. On the other hand, like all I wanted to do was make something that people watched. And the thing that I miss is the communal part of it. I love the idea that you have to wait a week between the episodes. I love the idea that the shows stick with you. This movie sticks with you. There's just like a resonance that happens. And it's not just water cooler conversation. It's the idea that you'll live with it a little bit. But I think it still happens to people when they watch the show. It does change the pressure on the narrative to watch them all at once. And I always promised AMC that I would have something in the story every week that would propel people to the next week until I did the 13th hour of each season. But some of it is just, it's there for the experience. There are whole episodes that are about things as vague and amorphous as how do other people see you? That's a story for me. That's a plot. So sometimes when you're ripping through them that fast, you don't get to enjoy that part of it. But you know what? I've binge watched plenty of stuff. I understand the joy and the impatience of you know what? Let's just finish the ice cream right now. So that's all I can say is like it's changing, and you kind of got to get with it the same way. This is on video on demand on the same day it's in the theaters. All this stuff. This is the way it's happening, and entertainment is important to people. So that's all you hope is that you can get them to enjoy it with some meaning. I have a huge DVD collection, most of which I've never opened. I just want to own them.
Great fan of MM. Thank you. On the movie, did you personally do any rewriting? I guess this applies to Mad Men as well. A lot, improvise or stage?
There's not a lot of improvisation because the script was around for so long. Of course, with these two actors, you can't just like rule it out. And there's a lot of lines to learn, which they're not always in movies that have lines like this. But rewriting it constantly. I mean, Danny, you'll agree with this. That's the hardest part is when to stop rewriting. And in fact, I even had, when we went to shoot the movie, it was 33 days. It's a real independent movie done with an independent budget. So started saying, like, well, what can we do to cut it down to make it in the schedule? The writer's room at Mad Men, the script went through it, and they helped me cut everything that I needed to cut. And I did a rewrite as late as 2 days before production. But once we were on set, I tried not to mess around with it. There's too many other factors. And who knows if I'll be like that the next time I do the next movie. I may loosen up a little bit. I'm impressed with writers and directors like David Russell, who can throw lines out from behind the camera or let people sort of find things. But I believe casting is half of it, and a scene like that Will scene is something that it is comedically pretty specific. And so all you do is you rehearse it and rehearse it and rehearse it till the timing's right, and then you start shooting it and hope everybody can hold on to that rhythm.
You seem to have an interest in other eras. Obviously, you mentioned this movie has reference to the 70s and all those great films. And, of course, Mad Men is the 60s, and even the Amish, they're sort of from another era.
Oh, boy.
God knows what era that is. So what is this fascination with trying to draw from other periods, and what did you do in your own head to look into those eras?
It's just, you only know the period you know. I wasn't even alive before, like, season 5 of Mad Men. Forget about what your earliest recollection is. I think we're all obsessed with other periods. I think, you know, we're in a culture that's certainly obsessed with time travel. And I think it's part of the technological explosion that's happened in the last 10 years. We won't know what it means because we're in the middle of it. And it's very friendly and very warm, and a lot of it's very good, but we don't even know what we're clinging to. We don't even know why, you know, my iPhone has a wooden case on it, and I'm not the only person who wants that. Who knows what that is? That's all it is, you know. This is a very contemporary movie. It's absolutely drawn from right now, but the style of filmmaking is from another era. And the style of storytelling is something that I felt is one of my favorite eras in film. Those are, and I don't think it's just because it's my childhood, because I was definitely too young to see a lot of those movies when they came out, and I saw them anyway because that was another part of child rearing in that era. Was, you know, everything was basically had just stopped being rated G very recently, so we'd go to the drive-in and see things that were not appropriate. I saw Shampoo in a drive-in. I must have been like 9.
Hey.
Hi.
So I have a question that's directed towards your opening. It's more about the choice of going towards RJ-D2 for your opening.
Of Mad Men, the
yeah,
credits?
It's kind of a brilliant way to approach an opening to me, and not visually but sound-wise. And was that conscious, or was someone like, "Hey, check out this artist? He's awesome"?
No. You know what it was? It's funny because it's so codified now. I thought of all the opening title sequences that I loved. The Sopranos being one of the most amazing ones. It's a minute and a half long. The other one's MASH, Mary Tyler Moore, Get Smart. You know, just like the Beverly Hillbillies, honestly. You know, you just sort of like think about if I'm going to do a title sequence and I only have 35 seconds. And so I had this image. And then as we started realizing that we couldn't really shoot it, I always wanted the show, it's the reason why the show's not in black and white. I did not want the experience to be abstract. I am, at least at this point in my life, very interested in reality or approximating reality the way it feels to me. And yes, the people are more eloquent than we are in our lives, but there is, part of the pace is to make it feel like reality does to me. And one of those things was saying, like, I heard that song on NPR, on Marketplace, as an interstitial song, and I already had the imagery in mind, and they were sort of working on the animation, and I had gone to, we turned into the network with Beck's New Pollution and just title cards. I had the idea that there was something slightly retro but electronic would give us both things, and it's the reason why the opening titles are so clearly not cell animation. I wanted it to look animated, but I wanted it to look like it was done now. And so things like that are always, it's not rotoscoped, it's like it's computer graphics. So the song did the same thing for me. And as you know, that song we now know is like a mix of a sample of an old, and I just heard it and I just thought it sounded like French movie music and a little bit dramatic, and I liked the drive, and it felt like a guy falling off a building. It's just lucky. That's really what it is. And let me tell you something. Just again, to comment on technology, hearing a song on NPR and trying to find it was really, really hard. You couldn't just go to the website. And this is like 2007. So.
What kind of advice would you have for young filmmakers who aspire to be like you?
I'm supposed to say something really glib and mean here, but I actually am going to take that question seriously. Because I will tell you, the first thing I can tell you, and Danny will vouch for this as well, I went to things like this and used every grain of inspiration that I could to make people that I admired my mentors without ever meeting them. Some of them are dead. And I looked at their lives and saw how long it took for things to happen for them, and it just was the way for me to survive in the face of rejection. And I can tell, I mean, you can say, I told you, I wrote the pilot for Mad Men 14 years ago. There's been a lot of rejection. In fact, there's like 99% rejection. And it's very hard, and you start to sort of protect yourself, and you don't want to become bitter in the face of any kind of setback. Things don't work out the way you want them to. And I have a really supportive family and friends, and I just try to keep finishing things. It's really the key. And you're going to beat yourself up, but I always look at it this way. If you write one page every day, at the end of a year, you will have 365 pages. That may be more than you've ever written in your life right now. And you miss a day here, you fall off the wagon, whatever. But it's still, if you can finish things, you will get better. It's just that simple. And don't be afraid to if there are people like me that are honest about how hard their journey was, use it. Stay with it, you know. I was writing the pilot for Mad Men right when The Sopranos came on the air. And I actually, it's almost a coincidence. And then I saw it and I was like, well, Don doesn't kill people, but they're kind of similar. If this, you know, that thing being successful was so invigorating for me. And that David was significantly older than me when it happened to him. It all was like, okay, here we go, you know. You can read Outliers and things like that and talk about these 10,000 hours, but the fact remains, whatever the story is, the Beatles played together for 8 years before they had a record. They started very young, but that's the Beatles. And usually successful people just hide that. And that's all I can tell you is, like, get your imaginary mentors and finish stuff. Can you think of anything else? You can answer that.
Yeah, I would just say along those lines, just keep writing. I mean, if that's what you want to do, if you want to write, you just have to keep writing, and whatever happens with the projects can be out of your control at a certain point. And listen to these stories of how many years it took for these projects to come to fruition, but the projects not getting made didn't prevent Matt from writing. And for me, it took me 6 years before I sold my first project, and I wrote all through those 6 years, and lots of rejection to this day, but I just keep writing. And you get better. That's one of the most important. You just get better by doing it.
Yeah, if you're not getting better, you should. It's bad. I'm going to say
that's discouraging.
I'm going to make that diagnosis right now. Be prepared for people to say no and figure out a way to deal with it. And he's right. Just keep writing.
You just get kicked around. So at every level of your career, you get kicked around. So you just have to keep doing your work.
Hi there. You mentioned that at times the movie took some spiritual turns. Could you elaborate more of how it happened since you didn't make it part of your script, it just happened?
Well, I mean, it's in the script. I guess I didn't know that it was on my mind. And I guess that when I talk, I mean, a lot of my work is about loneliness and how we're connected to each other. And I think that as the movie asks the question over and over again, what holds us together and who deserves to be together and how do you earn someone's love? How do you deserve someone's love? Or does it just happen? Are they just there? That's a kind of dark question. And you do, you know, the answer started to come up very, very, the answer was always, are you here? The answer was always like, can you have a moment? Can you be in the moment with another person? Can you appreciate that? I did not know that asking that question was a spiritual question, I guess. I just wanted to pay attention to what was good and see if I could take these people who were kind of inhibiting each other's ability to grow, and get them to a place where they change. They kind of switch places over the course of the movie, and have them not walk away with nothing, because being an adult is a compromise. And you do lose your ability to be irresponsible, and you lose your ability to hate authority for the most part, and you do become part of the machine. And if you are mentally ill, you will have to take the compromise of not feeling your disease, of not having those incredible highs, because the lows are too much. That's all a compromise of growing up, and you will lose something. So what do you get out of it? And that was what became the spiritual part of it. It was that answer to that, and it's in the movie. It was a surprise to me, as it is sometimes. It sounds mystical in some way, but sometimes you're writing and you're just telling a story, and you don't even know what's on your mind until it's done, and that's magic. And by the way, you don't do that by yourself. It's the part of the amount of people it's not just the credits. There are, forgetting about all the friends of mine that read it over the years, all the actors that read it over the years and gave me thoughts, all the producers that rejected it and gave me thoughts, all those things. There's 500 or 600 people's mindset in this, and that's spiritual, believe me. And I really appreciate it, Danny.
My pleasure, of course. Great seeing you.
Thank you, everybody. I hope
Thanks, everybody. Too.
I'll take either of these. These are great.
It's not bad.
I admire both of those.
What was the spark that started this particular story? Was there something very specific that made this idea pop for you? And then how did that flourish?
It was it's like a lot of ideas. It was a bunch of things sort of going together. I mean, one of them was my wife's family, has a family business, and there was an issue about her mother's getting up in years, her father's been gone for a long time, and I saw the family sort of like what was going to happen to that business, and the successful, more transparently successful children were not really entitled, except for that their life is actually not progressing at all. And you don't know if the friendship is holding their life where it is or if it's the best thing in it. But as bleak as that concept of growing up is, what I really wanted to say was like to have a friendship like that is that's the first line I had in the movie is what's in the trailer. That's the first thing I had written down was that friendship is a lot rarer than love because there's nothing in it for anyone. And I just kind of wanted to say like, well, what if you strip everything away? Don't act like that's nothing. That's everything.
What's so interesting, you were talking about the films of the 70s because it does have such a Hal Ashby vibe. This movie does.
He's one of my favorites.
And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I love it so much. Is that it feels like a Hal Ashby film, and in some ways a James L. Brooks film.
And about 2.5, 3 quick years later, I got a job on The Sopranos. And after my first season on The Sopranos, I wrote this movie. And so it was another 4 years before I wrote the second episode of Mad Men. And it's now been 14 years since I wrote the pilot of Mad Men. And, 9 years for this. So obviously it takes a while to get stuff made. Some of it was because I was busy. But, I mean, this was a story that came to me. And I don't really think in terms of genre. I don't really think in terms of formula. My intention was kind of to do a movie in the tradition of the early 70s movies that I love that are often socially conscious and have a lot to do with the truth and sort of present life as it is and are not formulaic. I don't know if you know the movie 5 Easy Pieces is a big favorite of mine.
And let us welcome the writer-director, Matthew Weiner.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So, how are you, Danny?
Thank
you for doing this.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So you have spent the last 10 years doing one of the most acclaimed, iconic television shows of all time. And coming off of that, you then make your feature directorial debut, because you directed multiple episodes of Mad Men, with this movie. Why this story coming off of Mad Men?
It doesn't really lay out like that. I'm sure
how does it?
It lays out, well, basically I wrote the pilot of Mad Men, and I kind of turned, the issues of what was going on for me, which is not just our experience of being alienated. And I'd reached a point in my life where I was happily married, I have kids. My wife is certainly my best friend, but my male friends had really disappeared. And I was saying, like, you see friendship, so it's such a wish fulfillment in most entertainment, the bromance and as Steve says it in the movie, nobody eats alone, And I was like, so what does hold friendships together? What is holding things together? And then I added into it basically 2 characters who I think in some post-cinematic way think that they're living in a stoner comedy.